Hello, this is Mr. Nolan, and I just want to do this really quick screencast just on a few items of fungi that we talked about on Thursday of this week. The first thing to recognize that we're still early in the unit, the fungus unit, so we're still expressing ideas. But what we did on Thursday was we added a question to the driving question board. We did our fungus pretest. We also combined our data, our fungus lab data between two desks. But the most interesting thing that we did was we talked about a few things that we can observe about fungi in order to learn how they behave. So one of them we looked at was what's called fairy rings, and we also looked at another phenomenon that I'll show you in just a moment. What we also did in class after we talked about those was we used the Expressing Ideas tool 1.2, which looks like this. And so this is in your packet. And so we looked at this in class as well. So to start off, let's think of some phenomena that we can use to explain how fungi work. Because this is really our goal for today, was to be able to identify the most important parts and functions of fungi. And just as a reminder, our summative assessment is due December 19th of this year. So a couple of autumns ago, I was outside, and this was kind of early on a Saturday morning. I had just had breakfast, and so I went outside to throw some shells out in my compost pile, some eggshells. And a few days before, I had actually mowed the lawn, and I threw my grass clippings out in this wooded area outside of my house. And as I stood outside of this compost pile and I tossed my compost, my eggshells and table scraps, I noticed something. I was standing about 5 feet away from it, and I noticed the air was about 46 degrees. This is just a temperature thermometer that I used. But the compost pile was 101 degrees. And so I felt that from a distance, and I was really kind of amazed at just how warm that was. And so I took some pictures because I just thought, this is really interesting. This compost pile, even though it's kind of cool outside that morning, it was really hot in the compost pile. And I was fascinated. This is very, very interesting. So I started digging through the compost pile, and the first thing I noticed was that obviously it was very, very hot. When I put my hand in there, it was even hotter in the center of the pile. It was very, very hot. And the grass that was underneath the surface was almost like gray and slimy, and it was really decomposing quickly. And it also stank pretty bad. So these grass clippings were decomposing and emitting a ton of heat. So that was something that I thought was really interesting, and so I recorded that. So one thing that we might be able to sort of assume about fungi is that they generate heat energy. The other thing that I have noticed in the past is this odd phenomenon called fairy rings. A fairy ring is the circle of grass that's kind of a different color. This fairy ring we can see, it's kind of easy to see. But then sometimes there are fairy rings that are a little harder to see, such as this one. We have a fairy ring right here. And if we look carefully, we might be able to see one kind of in the background, way back here. So they come in different sizes and even kind of different shapes. Sometimes they're a full circle, and sometimes they're not quite a full circle. Here's another one, a set of them that's kind of hard to see. There's one, and there's one. And these actually have to do with fungi. There's another. This one's kind of easy to see. But the way that we know that they have to do with fungi is that if you let them sit long enough, sometimes you'll actually see some fungi, like these mushrooms, show up on the edges of the fairy ring. And they form this really neat, nice little circle. So this is some pretty interesting stuff. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Hank Green and let him kind of explain things. If you want to watch this video on yourself, you can go to this YouTube video. It's right there. But this is just from SciShow, and so I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to SciShow and let him talk for a few minutes about what's going on with the fungi and what does this mean as far as our understanding for fungi. Can we use this to figure out important parts and functions of fungi? So let's head over to Hank Green here. I'll just let him play.
A few weeks ago I was walking in the park and I came across something kind of weird, something that I could not immediately explain. And when that happens, It's usually pretty annoying for me. It was an arc in the grass of greener grass, about 10 feet long, as if someone had very carefully spread fertilizer along a curving stripe of the park. And once I saw it, I started to see more, dozens of them spread across the park. One of them was even a full circle. When I find something just hanging out in the park that I've never heard of and I can't explain, that's frustrating. But thankfully, I have Google and SciShow as a lovely, helpful audience because now I have the answer: fairy rings. Maybe you've seen one of these yourself, an arc of greener grass or an arc of deader grass, or even weirder, a perfect circle of mushrooms. Before we had science, people thought that these might be portals between worlds. If some weird nuisance was occurring in the village, it was likely caused by elves or fairies coming into our world through fairy rings. But alas, this is not the case. I've already given you a hint as to what they actually are. The key players here are not some elven mischief makers, but fungi. The most common fairy ring mushroom is the Scotch bonnet, and like most fungi, the bulk of its body is its mycelium, and it's underground. The mycelium is kind of like a subterranean tree with thousands of fine branch-like structures that grow outward in a circle. As it expands underground, the mycelium releases chemicals that break down organic matter in the soil nearby, so it has food by the time it grows.
So I sort of cut Hank off so that I can talk about this a little bit. These white fuzzy things that we see underground are a part of a fungus. And the part that we see here, these sort of, these threads that sort of wind their way through the ground are called mycelia. Mycelia are these fuzzy, sort of furry, these thread-like structures that wind their way through the ground, and they absorb nutrients for the fungi. And after the fungus has absorbed enough nutrients, they will produce mushrooms. And so those mushrooms are really just the fruiting body of the fungus. So this is called mycelia. They grow underground, and they actually form the bulk of the fungus. So I'm going to go ahead and let Hank pick it back up here.
Tree with thousands of fine branch-like structures that grow outward in a circle. As it expands underground, the mycelium releases chemicals that break down organic matter in the soil nearby, so it has food by the time it grows there. And since by doing that, it's basically fertilizing the soil as it goes, the grass above the leading edge of the mycelium for a short time has more nutrients available than usual, which creates rings of rich, thick green grass. When the mycelium reaches the enriched soil, though, the party is over because the fungus then absorbs all of the nutrients out of the soil and the grass above it dies. And it's at this point, as the fungus matures, that you see the stuff that you probably think of when you think of fungus. Mushrooms begin to sprout, which are actually known as the fungus's fruiting bodies. They're like the fruits of the tree. They generate and release spores that the fungus uses to reproduce. In some cases, unless there's some physical barrier to stop it, a fairy ring can grow for years and cover huge areas. One fairy ring in France was measured to be some 600 meters wide. It's important to note now that fairy ring can also be used to describe a different phenomenon. Redwood growths can also grow in something called a fairy ring. They're completely different, caused when shoots sprout up from the base of a fallen tree.
So I'm going to stop there. He goes on for a little while and says a few other things. But the important things to recognize here are that we ought to be able to identify those most important parts and functions of fungi, that they have the mycelia, which are these thread-like structures underground that grow. And it's because of those mycelia that we see these sort of round patches. It's the mycelia growing underground. And on the edges of those patches, we're going to find fungi, because that's the fruiting part of the fungus, are these sort of mushrooms. And what we should also walk away recognizing is that fungi produce heat, even if we can't measure it, even if it's not on the order of 100 degrees. Fungi and other decomposers do produce heat as they live and grow and function. So what I would ask you to do at this point, if you haven't already, is to go back into your packet and do the 1.2 Expressing Ideas tool, which again looks like this. And go through there and kind of start thinking about how can you model this? How can you show what chemicals might be going in and out of this fungus? If I have a fungus growing on what looks like a bagel or a piece of bread here, like what we're doing in class, what kinds of things do you think are going in and out of that fungus? What is it doing to the bread? What is the mold doing to the air? And then explain it and then come up with a question that you still have about it. But this is going to be a useful tool for you to do after that, thinking through that. So thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful for helping you to catch up with what we did on Thursday.